Hi, and welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. This podcast is about the place where design and development overlap. We talk with experts to get their point of view about trends in design, code, and how it relates to the world around us. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Knapsack. Check us out at knapsack.cloud. If you want to get in touch with the show, ask some questions, or generally tell us what you think, go ahead and tweet us at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Design Systems Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Strahl. Today, I'm here with Michael Jeter. He's the creative director at Zapier. Welcome to the program.
Hey, Chris. Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to talk to you. Mostly the idea here with you on this program is you have a tool that literally is all about connecting systems. And being that we're the Design Systems Podcast and we care a lot about systems, I thought that this could be an interesting conversation to kind of understand, your background, how you all think about systems, and some of the more like fundamental ideas of the connections that you try to create between these different systems and platforms. So maybe let's start with you. What do you do? How does your job at Zapier kind of relate to systems thinking?
Yeah, so creative director of brand studio at Zapier. When I joined about a year and a half ago, there was 2 of us. Now we have 12 people. So I actually have the design systems team for product and web on my team as well, and brand designers, brand writers, and producers that kind of all work together to create the story around Zapier, kind of connecting with folks. And from a systems perspective, it's my job to make sure that the user journey feels consistent and tells the same story from the moment you kind of see an ad all the way to kind of using the product and when you're inside that product. And that kind of emotional resonance is something that connects all the way through. And so we use systems to connect those dots.
There's this interesting thing that's kind of happening with design systems and brand that I think is a really fascinating trend, right? This is going to sound like I have a chip on my shoulder, but I promise I don't. Brand folks still have this rooting in a physical brand that I think is really interesting, right? So when you think about what is brand, there's obviously the content side of it. There's obviously things like the aesthetic, things like the brand voice, all these different aspects to brand, but a lot of that is still grounded in this physical idea of what a brand is. And then you look at the advent of design systems, and now all of a sudden you have these things that basically represent or hold the digital representation of that brand. And using the ideas of Alchemotova and the idea of perceptual patterns, how much has that been a transition for you managing a design systems team, thinking about your brand differently because it's now housed in this sort of central place?
Yeah, I think, if you look at design from an evolutionary perspective of kind of the branches of where it came from, like systems thinking was kind of built in within brands, from the 50s and 60s, right? So I think from a language perspective or a conceptual perspective on how one solves problems using design, systems have always been heavily a part of that, right? Like brand systems, books, and that kind of stuff. So I think it's not far off, but I think at one point, as you were saying, physical brand items, marketing kind of took control of brand design as a thing that we do, as a practice, and just made it all about kind of telling stories and marketing, right? And so I think there was a split from there for a lot of people who were all just designers who designed products and brand, and we were all doing all the same things, websites, whatever. And then we all split into product design and brand design, all that kind of stuff, right? And so I think a lot of brand designers kind of just love the storytelling side of things and are just want to be the most creative and most interesting. And that's kind of where the split, maybe that's where the chip on the shoulder kind of comes from. But I think for me, and the way I think about brand systems or brands in general, is that the system, it's kind of this idea of James Clear, that read Atomic Habits. He says we don't rise to our hopes, we fall to our systems, right? Or our habits. I think of systems in that way, right? It raises the bottom up for everyone and kind of allows for the quality bar for everyone and everything, and the way you're kind of talking about things to kind of meet in the middle, to be kind of consistent and help each other out as those kind of moments with the kind of user journey happens. There is a physicality to products, right? You have to interact with them and use them. And so I think that kind of dichotomy between what a product designer and a brand designer is something that's coming full circle again. And we're kind of stitching back together those pieces of how we think, because they've been so separate since kind of, maybe a decade now.
Yeah, I love that point of view. And it's funny, you're talking to a guy that literally bought his co-founder the brand guide for the National Park Service because we both love the outdoors so much. And that's his coffee table reader in his house is this cool book of branding that I got him. But the idea behind that sort of systematic approach to brand versus that storytelling approach to brand, I love how you talk about like those things being stitched back together, because there is so much of systems that are in play now. And, obviously systems help us scale. Systems help us create this area of focus that is outside of the rote and mundane and into the much more interesting. When you think about connecting that to storytelling, you're also talking about content, and you're talking about the idea of like, how do I connect this systematic approach to design and brand and also the systematic approach to content? Do you all have that as sort of baked into the way you think about systems?
Yeah, I think when you're thinking about all those pieces and parts, when you look at a company, especially at scales and gets bigger and bigger, so many people want to, especially as designers, want to solve problems in the most creative way, right? Like we're creative people. And so if you don't have a good system, then those people don't have the right problem to solve, right? They're just solving, hey, like fix this or whatever. This is a problem to do, like have a creative solution. And so that's not the full problem, right? Which the full problem is like fix this within a way that you are also making it feel like it's Zapier or whatever brand you're working with, right? Like it feels authentic, it feels kind of connected, it feels familiar and familial to everyone as they use it. And so I think a lot of folks forget that that's part of the constraints or part of the problems that you're trying to solve. And then they go off and they make something and it looks different, it's new and kind of like a new variant, right? Like all of a sudden, like we've got a new arm on the body that is the product. And you're like, wait a minute, like cool that we have 3 arms, but that feels like it scares people, right? And so I think that way within content as well, right? Like you're going to have a bunch of different writers, a bunch of different filmmakers or whatever, all making these different pieces. And they only know how to put out work that comes from them, right? Like you can only do what you can do, right? That's kind of the problem of the creative, is that your limitations are part of what makes your work interesting and new. And so I think these systems then kind of carrying out in that same way of being like, okay, here's, voice and tone, for instance, like here are some interesting tools and how can you create something kind of new and innovative and kind of, evolving the brand in a way that feels like it's something that you made that's interesting to you, but then also feels like it connects kind of that larger storytelling moment of what a brand is or what a system needs to be.
But I think that's interesting because what you were talking about there was constraints. And it sounds like at the end, you said that like that global idea of what the brand is that generally accepted set of constraints. And then it's the designer's responsibility to come up with something that's creative and innovative and interesting within that set of constraints. And I think that's a cool way of looking at it, where when you think about what represents a common ideology or a common concept of what a brand is or what a company is supposed to do with systems, it was really an agreed upon set of constraints. That's what that is. And I'd never actually really thought about it that way before. And then basically saying, now your job as a designer or as a producer or as somebody that's making content or whatever is to accept those constraints and then build something interesting within those.
Yeah. And the whole problem, it's kind of like, in design, there's like a toddler, like you're making the sand castle, this beautiful thing, and then a toddler comes in and just knocks it all over. And that is the concept of culture. Like your system has to be something that is base enough and reduced enough in its nature that it's tools to be consistent for the brand, but also to be able to be a part of the culture that it's interacting with, right? Which is changing all the time. And so if your systems are too constrained or too dialed in, you can't actually grow and evolve with culture and be something that's like a part of it. You kind of get like organ rejection in some ways. Like people are like, that's old, right? You start to feel old.
Right.
And I think about it kind of the show Westworld, there's this moment where they're, spoiler alert, everyone, if you haven't watched it, sorry, it's been a while. But like they realize that the robots are kind of, they're not working. Like they're getting too crazy or getting wild or going, insane or whatever. And they realize that's because they're adding too much code. They're trying to add new code to fix the problem. And they realize that humans are only like 22 lines of code. And that was like the big aha, and that's because it allows for all of the surprises that is to be a human, right? You need that's part of it. If you put too many rules into it, you're no longer human. And I think of systems in that same way, where it's something that humans have to interact with. So we have to recognize it as something that feels like us, like growing and evolving and learning.
Right. There's this sort of balance that you strike between this more rigid structure and something that's much more organic. And you need it to be an organism because it needs to evolve and change. But it also needs to be a strong enough structure that actually supports what you're trying to accomplish with it.
100%. I don't know why I'm down the body metaphor, but yeah, it's like walking around with no bones. You're like jelly if you don't have a system, right? Like, but what you do with those bones could be infinitely interesting.
My 4-year-old asked me the other day why we have bones, and it was a fascinating answer. Like it
I
makes you
have to
think.
hear it. I have to hear it. What did you tell him?
But it's like it's deeply philosophical, right? It's like, well, like bones are how we're able to move around and stand up, and it's what makes us have our shape. Otherwise, you just look like a blob on the floor. And he's like, ew, like a booger. And I'm like, yeah, like bones are why humans are not shaped like boogers. I never thought I'd say that on this podcast. But no, you're talking about the whole toddler and the sandcastle thing. It reminded me of, also like how kids learn, right? Like my 2-year-old definitely learns by like destroying things and then building them back in different interesting ways, right? He's got magnet tiles. He's got like piles of these things. And watching him like think about that creative structure and then wipe it all out and start over without a care in the world is sort of an interesting, like, maybe we're more like toddlers than we think, where we need to basically be able to like wash away that sandcastle once in a while so we can build back something that's maybe better and more interesting based on the things we've learned.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that that's going to be one of the biggest issues that we have to face as like systems thinking people as we move forward, is how quickly the world is changing and how to build systems that can change and adapt with it that still keep that bone structure. I think that that's something that we're struggling with right now at Zapier as we did this rebrand and kind of expressing it across all the different surfaces. Our system's pretty in depth for the marketing website and like all the components that are there. But once we want to change any of those at any massive scale, like the amount of engineering resources we need that we never have to do that means that we're kind of stuck 5 years behind on the website than where we need to be. Like we're about the future of how the internet gets made, right? Like pulling all of these things together is like, it's going to change the way we build companies and we build things on the internet. I mean, we're going to look back and be like, how did we do this, without this capability? And then we're still trying to figure out how to deal with components that are a few years old that don't really adjust and adapt to where we're at. So it's something we're currently kind of trying to think through right now. Like, how do we build a system that is scalable both vertically, but also horizontally within that kind of cultural moment that it needs to be as the company grows?
It's really interesting. We talk a lot about this internally, and Evan, my co-founder, and I talk about it at length. And it sounds really simple. In practice, it's much more difficult. The idea of a healthy system is more indexed on what you take away from it than what you add to it. And so we always thought about culling as one of the most important parts of pruning and gardening a design system, right? You want it to be a bonsai tree, not a shrub. And culling is really hard. Like getting people to let go of that component they spent 1,000 hours building is a really difficult thing. But the idea is you have to figure out like what makes space for something new inside your system. It's a huge like mind shift for the majority of people that work on systems like this, because you spend all this time building stuff up. And honestly, that's what product metrics are pushing you towards. Products are saying like ship more software. Designers are saying like, like make more designs. Like engineers are like write more code. But there is this like almost mindfulness to these moments where you say like, that's no longer use to me. Let me get rid of it. And there's a lot of discipline that comes along with that. And we're actually trying really hard to think at Knapsack about like what we might do to help support this, because it is something that, like you said, us systems thinkers, we need to think about that evolution and that change. So how do you make it so that you can gracefully give way to new things inside your systems?
Yeah, the idea of culling is really interesting, right? Because you think about that with birds, and you've got like the healthiest birds at the end of the day, like they still need to fly in that perfect V formation to get south or whatever, right? So it's like there's these ideas with systems that like you give a bunch of pieces and then people stack them together and it's like Mr. Potato Head, but the lips are on where the eyes go. And like the system itself has to allow for infinite scalability within its variability as well. And that's seemingly impossible. I mean, it's not, it's something we're working towards, but it's always such a difficult thing to be like, cool, any way you arrange it, it's perfect and beautiful and on brand. But I think that practice of pulling away and like taking away the things that don't work anymore, I think is essential for that, right? Like the kind of minimalist, idea of that means that it's always got the white space it needs. It's always got the kind of the moments of focus in a way that allows you to, again, do almost anything with it, which is pretty exciting. But you're right. It's terrifying to take a piece away and be like, but what about all these people that are using it?
That 6-year-old carousel is totally still the thing that I need on my home.
Yeah. And then you take it away and all of a sudden 2 years later, carousels are back. So for some reason you're like, wow, I never thought they'd be back. But
it's like clothing trends. It's like
Yeah.
I don't understand why they are. They just are.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, well, you also mentioned your rebrand. You had a really interesting sort of test of all this. It's a story that I just like you to just tell broadly first, because I think it is so interesting and it's very topical to what's happening in the world. And it kind of provides a unique, interesting backdrop to what you guys are doing at Zapier.
Yeah, but before I start, I'll do a quick shout out to Stephanie Briones and Adam Kaiplin, were our systems designers working on the system. We call it Zinnia during the rebrand, and so they'll come into play as the story. But yeah, joined Zapier a year and a half ago to rebrand the company. A lot of startups, I think, are in this position where some engineers start a really interesting idea, find product market fit really quickly, and don't really understand what marketing or brand has to do with it, because they're like, everyone loves us already. And so for many years, they kind of build a company. And then when you're first, that's great. But then when everyone else realizes that there's a lot of money where you're at and starts building their own, versions of you, brand all of a sudden becomes the only differentiator, right? Like they're all copying your product. So then what do you have if you don't have a brand that says that you're the leader and all that kind of stuff? So as Zapier started to realize that, brought me in. I was working at Dropbox before. I was a creative director there. Left Dropbox to build the rebrand. This is a very long story. I'll make it very short, but we worked for about 8 months. We worked with Instrument in Portland, actually, where you're at. Some good friends of mine. I've worked with them for many years at Dropbox as well. Built a brand, really leaned on the Z as this kind of like, we called it the chonky Z. It was this big, electric, bold, beautiful Z that you could just place on its own anywhere and it could stand, as a brand moment. I'm really excited about that. We go to launch it, express it across all, surfaces, design systems, everything.
And when was this?
We were going to launch March 26th, because I remember that because my birthday is March 24th. So we were like, I was ready. It was 2 weeks before launch and we were high-fiving, code frozen. Everything was done. We were planning our vacations. And then Russia invaded Ukraine.
And what's on the side of Russian tanks?
Exactly. Yeah. And so as that happens, they all had the same tanks, right? So Russians were blowing up Russian tanks and it was a crazy thing. So they started to paint a symbol on the side of the tanks to differentiate themselves. And that symbol was a Z. And that Z has become the symbol of that war. And I think is even banned in many European countries as even a symbol that you can like wear. It's crazy that that's even to that level where you can't wear a Z. But they started to use it as that symbol of pro-Putin kind of expression of war.
So you have this horrible tragedy that's happening in Europe. You have this rebrand that is like good to go. And then like this massive like black swan curveball hits you about like Z's aren't really cool anymore. And now everything is a Z. So what do you do?
So, after we decided the right thing was to not move forward with it, we decided two things. So this is where design systems is really interesting. The system was solid. We decided to just strip the rebrand out of everything and just ship everything that we shipped as like a design refresh. So like we still, our color of orange, like, stay with the old typeface, stay with the old logo, just like an update and beautiful photography, the way we showed product, all that kind of stuff. And that kind of alleviated, like the company had waited for us for 8 months to kind of help service them for all their other things that they're trying to do, right? They're like, cool, we'll patiently wait for a rebrand, but we need you. And so that allowed kind of to clear the pipes so everyone could like start working again in the way they know how to like pause, like redesigns on product and all that kind of stuff. And then we threw the whole thing away, started from the ground up. And we had 3 weeks to come up with a new visual identity system and 2 months after that to launch. And so the strategy was still really strong. I think that's a really important part too for systems to thinking about like strategy to me is the backbone of that. Like, what is the story? What is the why? What are we trying to do? Like that really grounds everything. And that's kind of like, a system in of itself that like allows everything to kind of move and kind of, in the way that it needs to kind of express itself, but still feel like true. And so that was really solid. So we used that to kind of rebuild from the ground up and ultimately shipped a platform as our mark to kind of showcase what was possible on top of that platform, which is that platform being Zapier. And so kind of what you were saying before, we're connect kind of all of these pieces of the internet together to build systems. And that's kind of boring in of itself, right? Like that like it's like just plugging a plug into a wall and being like, isn't this cool?
Right. Hey, electricity, that light turned on.
Exactly. But what you turn on from plugging that thing into the wall, that's interesting, right? And so really people were doing rad shit that we never even thought of as a company for Zapier with these tools to put together. And like, whoa, you could do that. We never thought about that, right? So the expression of how they were using this tool was super creative and it was really pushing the internet forward. And so we just reduced our logo down to next to nothing so that that expression of that creativity could exist on top of the logo. And we basically just got out of the way so that like our user stories could be something that we really celebrate. We're a big part of the brand.
That's awesome. I really love that. I mean, as somebody that runs a startup company, I feel very much the same way, right? Like we're supposed to be out of the way. Like we're about showcasing a customer's design system or their brand or their ideas about what their expression looks like. And, we always try to take a back seat in that role. This is a very interesting sort of battle test of, systems thinking inside of an organization where you had this really daunting move that you guys had decided to make, which was what we built is not going to work. Then having to go and rebuild that. In some ways, you were starting from scratch, but in other ways, you had a strong, robust way of thinking about your brand system and thinking about the structure of it. And then ultimately how to roll that out to your product that led you to be able to meet that rather ambitious goal of, hey, spend, roughly a third of the time you spent the last time to build the same thing.
Yeah, and it wouldn't have been possible without the systems that we built. One of the things that I think made me feel like it was possible was the first time around when I first started, I was talking to Stephanie Briones, who leads design systems. And she's like, we need to do a test. Like we need to make sure that the system itself is going to be able to take on all these changes and all these things, right? We were in a really pressure test. And so she recommended, let's just take someone else's design system and just take all the colors and the things and the pieces and just see if we can run that through the system or the kind of structure that we built and see if it could take all the things. We have everything we need. Does it break anything? Which was new to me as a way of thinking around design systems. And I really loved it. And so it's funny, we actually used Discord's brand system and just like ran it through and was like, this is how everything would look if we were, Discord color and Discord, all that kind of stuff. And this was kind of the idea that a system can take on anything, right? In a way, like that's how we knew it was right. And so when I was like, yeah, we can do this in that short amount of time, it's because of that testing that they did early on to kind of take on a few different kind of looks. I was like, all right, we can do this, right? We can get this through product. We can get this on the web. We can get in all the places that we need to do quickly. It's already battle tested, right? So that was super interesting to me to just watch a system work, which you don't necessarily get to see that very often, right? Like you don't get to see a system just actually be a system other than just kind of a framework that everyone uses, like pieces and parts. Like, let me take this and this and this, and it all looks like nice. But as being a tool to allow for rapid change, it was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, most of the time, the closest that people get to that is like, let me see my stuff in dark mode or whatever. Yeah. It's one of the things I always recommend in terms of implementations of design systems is to have some sort of brand variant that looks very little like what you do, and like don't spend a bunch of time on it or maintain it, or like what you all did and grabbed it from somebody else, just so you can understand how changes happen inside of that system. Because it's very abstract, right? When you sit there and you say like, oh yeah, I changed some, color palette centrally, and because that color palette references a bunch of other color palettes, which reference a bunch of variables in code, it all of a sudden shows up differently in my app. And like color is something that's actually pretty damn easy to understand. Like if something was blue, it's now green or it's orange or whatever, right? Spacing is a lot harder. It's one of those things that is a lot more challenging for people to look at. Animations, is even motion is harder than that. And so trying to understand how those changes flow through your system is a really important part of understanding the power of that system and why that system matters.
Yeah. Yeah. What levers do you actually have? Or like, oh shit, we didn't build a system that accounts for a completely different X height in typography. It breaks everything, right? Or like, oh cool, like new X height, it still works wonderful, right? So that's, yeah, exactly.
You picked my favorite example. that one, especially like native app wise, is real challenging. But that whole idea of piloting what a major change looks like, there's sort of this systems adoption methodology that's out there, right? Where it's like, all right, I need to get some very basic things in a system and approach it in a very systematic way. And that usually starts with tokens and a brand. And then what you want to do is you want to say like, what does that first component look like? And you want to pick something that's more meaningful than a button, but less meaningful than like the most important thing on your entire product. And then you want to pilot that because you want to understand how the implementation of a single thing works end to end. And then I think there's another level to that, which is like, well, okay, like what if we really stress test the system and we try to change everything in it at once? How does that work? And I think that very few people go to that step because they never really think about it in the context of like an emergency rebrand. But even if you're not doing something where you're basically saying, I'm going to throw out this entire thing that I spent 8 months building, it is important to understand how all those changes ultimately build a rugged system that can respond to all this change at one time.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot of change coming all of our ways, right? From a design perspective, we've got this AI stuff that's like rocking everything. You know, it's going to write things, it's going to write code, it's going to write prose, it's going to write docs. You've got art, you've got music, you know, all this stuff, like video editing. You've got new 3D worlds by which we're going to like have to exist and build product, like, you know, this metaverse type stuff, like, or AR or whatever, right? So I think this is a really interesting topic for us to think about at a point where like we're all going to either be ready for infinite variability as systems, or it's going to break and we're all going to struggle quite a bit. So I think it's fun to kind of project that out and be like, how are we leading and thinking of a system in that way? That's like, okay, cool. Now it can go 3D, right? Which kind of breaks your brain in a moment, but that's those moments that you were saying. It's like, take it small and then be like, what if I turn it upside down? You know, and how does that kind of work? It's pretty fun.
As somebody that's in a chair that says creative director, when you think about all those little mundane design decisions, like whether or not your buttons have square corners or rounded corners, like what your drop shadows look like, what all those other things are, like most of the time when I think about the justification of those decisions, you think about it is either like grounded in research or grounded in best practices, or maybe at best grounded in like real user testing. But the reality is we don't actually really know, other than a gut feel and maybe some nascent user data that is casually attached to that square corner, rounded corner question, which of those things really truly performs better. But now with the use of systems to look at these things in a very microscopic, minute way, we have a data set that is impossible for any human being to parse, but it's not impossible for AI and ML to parse. What if we start applying Midjourney or Dolly style applications to our actual product designs? Do we create better products from that? And I think there's a really interesting question there about like what happens when you start to apply AI to the systems that we use to build product.
It's really interesting. I've been playing a lot with Midjourney and I've been doing a lot of art direction stuff with it lately for like commercials and whatnot. And the backbone of how you use that stuff is also a system too, right? Like if I tell AI, you know, Midjourney, like I need a monkey on roller skates on a rainbow or whatever, like who knows what style it'll spit out, right? And so when I start to build out like actual like style systems, right? Like I needed it to look like a Leica with this type of film, this lighting reference, this artist, like that's what you're doing is you're building a system to kind of create from it like some predictability of what it's going to give you, right? Even though it's really surprising. And so I think that that's really interesting when we think about AI design tools and kind of testing is how does our ethos of systems dictate what we do and what we learn from those outputs, right? Like, because it could just output any app that works. But how is it yours? How does it like differentiate and feel special to a universe of users that expect Zapier or whatever company to do something? And I think that ethos of systems is going to be the thing that makes that AI part successful. And I think we'll reach new heights that we've never reached before because we can try so many different things, like you were saying, but it can spin out of control if you don't anchor it again to that kind of like that philosophical moment of like, what does systems mean? I think systems means the same thing to most people now. It's a system. But I think we're going to get to a point where we can brand a system. Like we're going to have a philosophy, like a Zapier philosophy to how we think of systems so that our AI creates something that feels right. And that's pretty exciting for me.
Yeah, I completely agree. There is still this very fascinating idea of intent that's there, right? And I can't tell you how many times that I've been in that same space and like, you know, trying to figure out what I send to a Midjourney bot. I've just like, I've begged for like a folksonomy or taxonomy that helps me understand how to create like the kind of thing I'm going for, because I still have in my mind, like, I want to give this form and I don't know exactly what form it is, but I have an intent that is there. And I think that brands and companies are going to have an intent that is there that still is probably largely curated by people. And I think it creates this whole new field inside of organizations that look at like those ethos people, right? Like, what does this brand really represent? And how do the things that I generate or that are generated on my behalf by robots actually represent that intent well and that ethos well? And that's where like the new creative frontiers really are here, right? Is it's not in redesigning the next great button. It's in figuring out how to have the right kind of language applied to robots that build that for us. And not just that button, but that whole experience.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are afraid that's going to take away the human element. And I actually think it's going to be the opposite. I think right now we're doing the best we can with the tools that we have. I only have so much knowledge. I have so much history. I was born and raised here and have these parents and these friends and read these books. Could bring that. AI can take the entirety of human thought and idea, right? Like it can probably create something more human as an experience than we can because it's more inclusive to what it means to be human, not what it means to be Michael Jeter. And, we see that as a problem a lot of times in product building, right? Like it's just a lot of white dudes making a lot of things that they forget, like, oh shit, this doesn't work for women or for minorities. It's a problem in tech. And it's something we're trying to fix, but it's something that's real. And it's something that I'm really excited about from that aspect of like, it can actually spit something into, a product that's probably more human because it goes, well, you guys care about Shakespeare over here and Steve Jobs over here. And, whatever, show or movie. And it's like, let's like create emotion within this moment of a product that like meets you where you are. I could be wrong, but that's my hope right now.
You got to keep that ideology strong, right? Like, is it a bunch of white dudes sitting around creating content that ultimately gets fed into the AI? Like, yeah, right now it maybe is. But I think that there's definitely this hopefulness attached to it that is really exciting. And I think that as we push this new frontier, being thoughtful about how we make it inclusive is a really important aspect to it. And it's one thing to be sitting around talking about inclusivity. It's another thing to actually be thinking about like what that means in terms of the content and the things that get generated. But there is like a lot of interesting hope there about, it's not just like Chris from Portland or Michael from Austin. It's about like a human perspective that is much more broad about the things we build.
Yeah, totally. A way we approach trying to find, inclusivity or equality or, whatever kind of like level that we want to pull into work is we tend to reduce things down to checkboxes. That can mean systems, that can mean work, that can mean hiring, right? Like, well, you've got these 6 things that you have to check yes or no with these candidates. And that actually creates a really like non-innovative or uninnovative rather world where like people who exist outside of those checkboxes are no longer included in your math of what you're going to do because you're trying to make this thing that like you're reducing things down to be for everyone, but then it's kind of for no one. And I think that's just our lack of ability to understand the complexity of these problems, which again, I think these like broader computing power moments can be like, here's 5 other solutions you never would have thought of. You're like, holy shit, you solved it. Like it's these moments where we're going to be so excited to be like, oh, we never would have thought of that because we couldn't see it. We can't see around corners where some of these things might be able to.
I love this as a counterpoint to like dead internet theory. Are you familiar with dead internet theory?
No, but I really need to.
Yeah. So it's like, there was this thing on Reddit for a while. I think it went elsewhere. But anyway, there was a fascinating article about it that I'll put in the show notes that is all about how the internet maybe isn't real anymore. And that it's really just a bunch of robots that have pre-generated content that are all sharing content with each other. And it's just this like sophisticated set of AI that is amplifying itself to the nth degree. My whole thing with that, and like it was actually perfectly expressed in this. So I was like, no, that can't be right. And the reason why it can't be right is because there is still like this need to represent the intent as humans to create content that appeals to us. And maybe I'm underestimating the robots, but there still feels to me like, you need to have a human hand guiding this in some method for now that ultimately represents the kind of content that we all want to consume. But it's a fascinating read about how, there is this dark, like sort of Scanner Darkly dystopian cyberpunk future where the internet isn't really actually created by people anymore. It's all created by robots amplifying and sharing each other's content as sentient algorithms.
Yeah. It gets interesting because the apple may not fall far from the tree of the creator that is the human, which is this idea of like, do we have free will, right? Like that's the same kind of idea where it's did you choose your parents? Did you choose where you're born? Did you choose your genetics? Did you choose, all of these things? Like, you only can make the choices that are given to you within the constraints that were given to you from those moments. And so did you ever even have a choice truly? And so there's something about that where it looks at the internet, where there's also all of these things that are creating these things, right? These that are structures where, like, yes, you may be creating content on the internet, but some dark force or invisible force of bots behind you are also creating the way the internet works in some ways, like the way like Google is indexing your whatever, right? So you can go kind of both ways where you're like, yeah, we're still making content as humans, but like, to what end and why? Like, what's forcing us to make it in the way we're doing it? It's because we're applying ourselves to a way that the internet works in culture right now. But why does it work that way? Did we make it that way? Like, it's at what point did we have a decision in this? Is kind of an interesting question.
There's a whole lot. Like, we're going to devolve into like the existence of higher powers here pretty soon. And are those, Google and the internet?
Right. Yeah.
Oh, but I think you're onto something though, right? Like this idea of how much of the content we create is going to be within our own control, and how much of the systems that we rely upon are going to be the things that create the content versus curate the content. And all these are foundational questions to the future, and they're coming faster than we think. I mean, we're already talking in Knapsack about like what generative systems we're going to use to help you build better components that make better products. There's already a dozen things that are out there that help you, like, feed your URL into this site, click a button, and it will remix a new brand for you based entirely out of, ML and looking at a bunch of other comparable brands.
It's fascinating.
And all of that it's coming for us, and it's going to be here really, really quickly.
Yeah. I mean, I think of my 12-year-old son, and, supposedly he can create Twitter from bubble.io, right? Like, no code. He can just make it by himself today as a 12-year-old. Well, shit, he has to be able to design it. Well, not anymore soon, right? Like, there's a point. And so, like, it kind of actually boils it all back down to my thought around like how systems help us be more human. It's kind of what we're talking about at the full circle back to the beginning. But he can just have great ideas and fully express human ideas and not be held back by the tools or his lack of knowledge. Like, and I think when you've got everyone doing that and those things kind of collide in new ways, the ideas that we can have are probably going to be more human than we've ever done before, right? Like, we've been on the opposite forever. We've like assembly lines, not a human concept. It's a concept for capitalism. It sucked. We're still suffering from it today as humans, right? 8 hours. What does that even mean, in a day? And so that's just not where we are anymore. And so there's going to be a point in which people are just sit around like you and I right now, or like back, in the heyday of being in Paris at a cafe, right? And being an artist and just like talking philosophy. And then those moments kind of inputting from a systems perspective, like, great idea, let's put it in, let's see how it works. And having something generate a product that all of a sudden like changes the way that we interact with the world in some way that's really interesting. And I think, again, really high level from a systems perspective, but I think that is the base idea. That's the beauty of systems, whether you take it all the way to craziness of AI or just today in like a design system in Figma or anywhere where you kind of build these systems. It allows you to bring the bottom up, right? So it's like things that kept you from being able to do what you need to do before, no longer. The bottom is brought up, so the quality is there, so you can express yourself, solve the problem at its highest level in a way you couldn't do before, right? You really have to start from zero.
I love that vision for the future. I think that's really cool. The idea that, we can create something without constraints. And I think it's interesting also that there's like a little bit of a paradox there, right? Like, because systems are about constraints. And so the acceptance of constraints to be able to free ourselves from them is like this interesting kind of paradox of how we all think about building product.
Yeah. I banged my head against systems for so long. I truly did. And becoming a convert, because I was just punk rock skateboard kid from, like, just like, fuck, like everything's made up. You guys like old people, you made all these stupid rules. And so I thought that expression, like the David Carson world of design, was everything for so long, right? In the 90s.
I can just see you in like a Nirvana shirt, like with a skateboard and some,
exactly.
Like spikes on your wrist or something.
Exactly. Yeah. Spiked up hair. It was a Rancid shirt, but close. And then,
I'm there.
But and it wasn't until I was in Marfa, Texas, at Donald Judd. He took over that whole town, made his whole like art town. If you haven't been there, it's phenomenal just to see like a human who is an artist like take over a town, and now it's just his art and all of his friends. But he has this exhibit where it's 100 pieces of the same thing. It's 3D sculptures. They're all the exact same steel, exact same dimensions, height, width, depth, whatever. And you're like, this is going to be the worst art I've ever seen, right? Like you're just like 100 of the same thing, and like you're like, I'm like the art nerd. He's like, come on, family, you're gonna see that. There's like, God, really? Like the 100 of these. And within it, he uses different planes of steel to do different things within those boxes, right? And it's really for him, it was an expression to see like, how far can I push myself within constraints to continually make something that's very different than every other one? And 100 of those. And it wasn't until I walked through all 100 of those where I was like, oh, like
wow.
I really got it then, right? Like I really got that kind of beauty of constraint and really what it meant to be a practitioner or a designer in that perspective, to use that as your like helper or your tool or your place to actually show how good you are. Because like anyone can make anything if they have enough time and space. It's really when you're doing something within constraints that you show how skillful you are. That was like a game changer for me.
That's fucking cool. Now I really want to go there and see this, because it sounds like, yeah, it's like you said, right? Like anybody can make anything given enough time and energy put towards it. But making 100 of something and then making them all feel and act and be different, like that's a much more interesting problem space.
Yeah.
I love
you started to get to like 80 and 90 and you were surprised. It was 2 different buildings, these big like army barracks. And you're like, cool, I went up to the first 50 in the first building. Like it's just going to be a 50 more. And then each row you get to, you're like, wow, oh, wow. Like you actually start getting into it, like excited, like dramatic about like, oh my, that angle. How have I not seen the angle unless it was obviously pretty passionate about these days. But that's maybe the interesting thing about systems that we're talking about from a brand perspective, right? For me, it's all about story. It's all about human connection and emotion. And like, so how does a system bring those things together? And I think that we all root for the underdog, right? And there's something about, wow, you're able to do that within that constraint or that set of tools. I wouldn't have done it that way, but it's really exciting to see that you did. And I think that that's what makes us excited, at least as designers. But I think other people feel that kind of passion within those constraints as well.
So, Michael, this has been a journey, truly. I really, really appreciate you. Thank you so much for being on.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Let's do it again sometime over drinks.
Sounds great. That's all for today. This has been another episode of the Design Systems Podcast. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions or a topic you'd like to know more about, find us on Twitter at the DS Pod. We'd love to hear from you with show ideas, recommendations, questions, or comments. As always, this pod is brought to you by Knapsack. You can check us out at knapsack.cloud. Have a great day.